didn't really respond. Um, as I said, McDonald's didn't respond, but one of her executors of her will did respond. And not only did he respond, but he invited me to come visit him. He's an older man in Chicago. And as I say, I could go on and on about the process of it, but over time, I was able to unravel the story of Joan. And then comes the part of selling the story. When you write a nonfiction book, you have to write about a third of the book to prove to a potential publisher that you understand the story well. It's anybody can say, "I have a great idea for a book, and let's write about the history of this device. Who made this device?" Well, yeah, that's great, but until you write enough and research enough, no publisher is going to buy that book unless you are a serial killer or notorious, and somehow politicians who may be seen as serial killers these days, uh, celebrities, of course, they can all sell books pretty easily, but the rest of us have to prove it. So I'd gotten enough information that I felt I understood the story of Mrs. Kroc, that she had grown up poor, that she'd married Ray after he married two other people, and so on, and how he inserted himself into the McDonald's operation, how the McDonald's operation itself had started. But my first go round, the publisher said, "We don't really care about her." I said, "How could you not care about this woman? She was this major philanthropist. She saved NPR. She did all this good, and in an interesting way. And she's tied to this iconic American brand." And they said, "Well, books about somebody we don't know aren't going to sell." I said, "But her name is said on the radio every day." Didn't work. And then all of a sudden I read that there was going to be this movie called The Founder about the creation of McDonald's. So I went to my literary agent, who's your sort of buffer zone between publishers and the authors. And I said to the literary agent, "I bet you anything if we tie this book to the movie, even though it's got nothing to do with it. But if we put in the first paragraph of this book that there's a movie coming out about Ray Kroc and the founding of McDonald's, I bet it'll sell." And it sold in a day. Bad, crazy lesson about the superficiality of publishing. But the stipulation was that it had to come out in time for the movie's release. So I had to quit that job now that I had a little money from an advance, and quit my little part-time job at KCRW and just nose to the grindstone, get this book out in 6 months about Joan Kroc. And thankfully, up until that point, actually, it was a little bit longer than 6 months at that point, but at that point, I had enough information that I felt that I could write the entire book, although it was quite intense to get it done in time. But nonetheless, I just kept digging and structuring and digging and structuring, and I just found myself completely intrigued, enamored, scared of Joan Kroc, who was deceased, because she seemed like a pretty ferocious person, but also, an angel, obviously. And in talking with various people who knew her at various stages of her life, including and especially this executor with whom she was very close for quite a long time, and particularly at the end of her life, I really felt like I was able to create an interesting picture. I hope I created an interesting picture of this woman. Now, then comes the family. So Joan Kroc, as you probably know if you've read the book, had one daughter, and that one daughter had four daughters. And eventually I made inroads with two of the daughters who I had a couple of meals with, and who convinced their mother to answer questions. And I kept explaining to them, you don't know who I am. I'm a credible person. I don't have a huge track record I have no track record in writing biography, but I want to honor Joan Kroc. And that doesn't mean I want to, put her up on a pedestal and show her to be a choir girl, because she wasn't, but I wanted to honor her. And I said, look at me as the biographer, the family biographer who you don't have to pay, who you didn't hire. And that sort of had some sway with them. And eventually I was able to talk to Joan's daughter to fill in the blanks. But what I've found now on book 4 is as you dig, you can find out quite a lot of information about people. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way, and I don't mean that I'm going to go do it about you, but it is possible, especially particularly with public figures, only with public figures, to dig and find a lot of information. Like, for instance, through public records, I found that Joan Kroc had filed for divorce from Ray because he was an abusive alcoholic. For instance, I found out about this charity that she began in her philanthropic journey. It wasn't the first thing she did, but was among the first things that was about alcoholism and combating alcoholism. And the reason that she did that was because alcoholism was so deeply entrenched in her personal life. So it's a really fascinating process. It's a psychographic process, although all the biographers in the world, I joined a biographers group and learned quite a lot just observing people and going to conferences back when people did that sort of thing and talking with people in that group. You don't want to psychoanalyze someone, but you are stitching together component parts of their life in a way from a distance that they may not have ever thought to do. And certainly in Joan Kroc's case, she didn't want it done while she was alive. But I just really enjoyed and immersed myself in the process of understanding who she was, and just absolutely loved it. And I hope it reads okay. It's frustrating to me that that movie depicts a lot of inaccuracies about McDonald's and about Joan. But also that someone isn't making a movie about Joan Kroc, because frankly, Joan Kroc, I think, is a far better story with Ray as a secondary character than the movie would be, Michael Keaton aside and all of that. But I think she's a really undersung hero, especially when we've seen in the last year or so Melinda Gates and Mackenzie Scott, right, is her maiden name, Mackenzie Bezos, taking the money from their incredible fortunes and really becoming benevolent. I just have wondered many, many times how Joan Kroc would just be standing in the background applauding them. Laureen Powell Jobs, widow of Steve Jobs, too. They're just doing incredible things, which is what motivated me to follow Joan, because I always thought if I could have access to that kind of money. I don't have access to that kind of money, and I still try to be benevolent, as all of you are obviously here today. But somebody who has that kind of money, it's just such a kick. So I can keep talking, but we can start taking questions and let that sort of guide our conversation if you want, or however.
Yeah, this was interesting after that last comment you made. We have a question. If Ray and Joan were alive today, what is the first question, Lisa, you would ask each of them?
What a great question. Wow. Well, I don't really even know how I would begin with them. Because I would just be so. I used to dream about Joan Kroc. That's how immersed I was in her life. It hasn't happened with my other two books, subsequent books, Ted Turner and these four women who helped start NPR. I'm gonna detour for a second, and then I will answer the question, because this will help me answer the question. By bizarre coincidence, if you believe there is such a thing, after my book came out, I wrote a story about various places in Southern California that were marked by Joan Kroc, like that chain reaction sculpture, which, by the way, she didn't even live here. She lived in San Diego. So that made that sculpture even stranger. Why was it here? And why did she know Paul Conrad? How did she subsidize Paul Conrad? All those things were questions that made no sense standing there. And as I started to unravel the story and piece it together, I found out about this ranch that Ray had bought, the J&R Double Arch Ranch, where he had married his second wife, and conveniently, when he divorced his second wife, he married another J on the property, Joan. So I had written a little bit about that. Some sort of excerpt of the book or something came out, and I got an email from a woman who I'd met doing a different story for KCRW, absolutely unrelated to chain reaction, Joan Kroc, anything like that. And she said, "You're not going to believe this, but I am sitting right now on the J&R Double Arch Ranch in Santa Ynez, California, because since I met you on this story you did 3 years ago, literally for 15 minutes, I met this woman. And she remembered my name, which was nice, and I remembered hers. She said, literally, since I met you, my husband got a job as the caretaker of this property that was the J&R Double Arch Ranch. She started sending me pictures, and the place was falling down. This is a whole other tangential story, but basically, when Joan Kroc sold that ranch in Santa Ynez, she sold it. She wanted to give it away and make it a summer camp for poor kids, but the zoning wouldn't allow that. So she had to sell it just on the open market. And the man who bought it was a vitamin impresario, bizarrely. Nature's Plus Vitamins. I'm struggling to remember his name right now. But he bought the property, and it had been in dispute because he married a much younger woman later in life to whom he left everything, and his adult children were not happy, and his young wife inherited the property. And this woman, Leslie, who I met on a story for KCRW, who's writing me this email, says that when she was a young model, she met this woman, Meadow, and they became friends. They'd lost touch. She married this vitamin magnate who was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and years later needed a caretaker for the property and happened to have reconnected with Leslie, hired her husband to come live on this property. So many, many times in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been a guest at this ranch that Joan and Ray Kroc used to live in and that they built. I mean, literally, he built it out. And she inherited it. She never particularly loved it. She started the alcoholism charity there. I've subsequently become friends, I would say good friends, with Ray Kroc's niece, who's now 81. And whose father ran the foundation that was headquartered on the ranch. So it would be so hard for me if I was sleeping on that ranch property where there are many, many parcels of land. I mean, they have parties there where it's like an inn. There's inns, beds everywhere. If I was sleeping somewhere on that property and Joan Kroc just presented herself to me in my dream, in reality, if Ray Kroc, because you can almost feel their presence when you walk around this property. I would, I don't really know what I would say, and it would probably be something super banal, like, how did you decide to build this roundhouse in the shape of a hamburger? How did you decide about the art that went in here? And what really went on here, because I've heard some crazy stories about things that went on that campus. It's 200 and something acres of land. Actually, it's up for sale right now. I should see if I can find the listing so you can get a sense of the pictures, because it is a pretty extraordinary place. But yeah, I'm going to keep thinking about that because there has to be a good answer to that question. And I'm sorry,
That's
I'm falling.
amazing. That's amazing. A building that's shaped like a hamburger. Now we're all dying to see that.
I know. I'm gonna find it while we're talking, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's another question, and I think this lends itself to more personal. How does being a public radio journalist affect your writing as an author?
Wow. It's really helped it a lot, because when you write for radio, you have to be very, very brief. Too brief for book writing, but it helps you hone your sentences. For years, I worked at the public radio show Marketplace, and really there, if you have a 4-minute story, that's like an encyclopedia. That's the equivalent of an encyclopedia in a public radio realm. So to have to tell a story in such a short period of time seems counterintuitive, that it would be good for book writing, but it helps you cut through the junk. And it just really helped me craft stories. And of course, when I was writing my first book proposal, before it was sold, while I was still working full time and I was coming home every night, I would go for a swim, I'd come upstairs. I live in this big giant apartment complex in downtown Los Angeles, and I would work on this proposal, and I'd be like, I gotta get out of this job. It's so shallow and superficial, it's driving me crazy. And then I would think, but wow, it's really helping me focus my writing. I think the other thing it does is when you work in radio, it just as when you listen to radio, you learn to listen to people differently because sadly it often means that you're listening to them because you're looking for a sound bite, but it also helps you also home in on really good details because you're looking, we all have a lot of extraneous words, but when you start talking and when someone starts talking and you're looking for that clip that you're going to put in a story that you have to get turned around really fast, it makes you more efficient with how you listen to somebody. And sometimes you can go too far. Sometimes you can get impatient. My husband talks, sometimes it takes him a long time to tell a story, and I'm like, move it, go a little faster. But when you're doing it just as a public radio, or as a reporter, not as a human, it's so fascinating how it forces you to listen to things differently and hopefully listen to people better and sounds around you better. So I think those are a couple of the ways.
It's so good. It's so true. I think other journalists would agree with you. Louis Bischoff has said they've listened to the audiobook 3 times and love both of their stories, Ray's and Joan's,
Wow.
and learning about the modern history of US. So the question is, what are your thoughts on how fast food changed the landscape of the United States?
Oh, indelibly. And I have to say, thank you so much for listening. And I hope you listen to my other books because I read all four of them. And that's always a fun part too, not every writer likes to do that, but I enjoy it. But, I think that we don't talk enough about how fast food changed the world. I mean, we know it's not good for you and we can rail against it all we want, but understanding the history of it, just like understanding the history of television and radio, as I have with my last two books, I think is incredibly important. And I think there's been a bias against this book, in part because there are a lot of people who just go, McDonald's, who cares about McDonald's? Well, McDonald's, whether you like it or not, is a major economic force. It's a place where many people get their first jobs. And to know that McDonald's started using fresh ingredients locally, that, when you bought a franchise, the person who bought this franchise that opened up in Phoenix, when the McDonald brothers first started franchising, had to source all of that stuff locally at a time when that was the only way to do it. We didn't have big refrigerator trucks, this whole shipping issue that we're having right now, the supply chain issue. And, we buy oranges in the store and they say they came from Australia. And we're like, wow, that was not possible back when at the beginning of McDonald's, or about, so the story of McDonald's really is the story of America and the story of how we've grown as a nation for better and worse, and how the way we've eaten is, for better and worse, completely changed. I mean, worse certainly in the sense of the portability of it. I mean, it's convenient, but the cascading effects of everything we do is it's incredible. I mean, I remember, I'm in my late 50s. I remember when my mother thought that eating Campbell's soup, and my mother worked full time, so I don't know how she did it. Now that I, am an adult, well, for years I've been an adult wondering how did she work full time and deal with my high maintenance father and us and cook real food, because the idea of packaged food to her was just abhorrent. Not to mention it was too expensive. We didn't have a lot of money, but she really railed against it. And now, of course, everything is packaged food. So and it all goes back to it's not McDonald's. I always say that if it wasn't the McDonald's brothers, there were other people who were trying to accelerate food because the car created this need and desire to have portable food, to have us commute. The car indelibly changed our lives, obviously. But I think a lot of people even forget that. They forget that it wasn't always the case, especially in the cities where we live, that you could just get in a car and go somewhere. I mean, air conditioning made it possible for us to live in the cities that we live in too. So, and electricity and water and all those. So there's so many ways that McDonald's has altered every aspect of our society. And I think it's important to understand it.
What was your favorite thing about writing this particular book?
Well, getting to know Joan's executor getting to see some of the places that she built. I haven't been to the Phoenix Croc Center, but I've been to a number of them, and they're spectacular. And of course, she didn't design, she designed the first one. She oversaw the design of the first one, which is wonderful and has transformed the neighborhood where it is. And seeing that, you know, seeing the tangible evidence of this McDonald's money, which is also an incredible story too. The idea that, you know, you might love or hate McDonald's, but wow, this money helped completely finance all of these wonderful things. Um, so I think seeing the tangible evidence of it, getting to talk to the people, getting to know Ray Kroc's niece, who really only started to trust me after the book came out, but I've learned more from her since, and um, I think also visiting, I mean, without question, visiting that ranch and seeing what it looked like was has been a pretty incredible,
She was
every
so
part of it.
she was so philanthropic. Do you know what the backstory was on how she chose where to leave her money?
Well, yeah, that's what's so weird is that it wasn't a calculated. You know, if you read Mackenzie, it is Scott, right? Mackenzie Scott's manifesto about, you know, today I'm giving away however many trillions of dollars, and I'm going to go to historically black colleges and rape crisis centers and food pantries. And she had, you know, really somebody, I'm sure it wasn't just her, really carefully researched all the different places and really thought about all of those gifts. And Joan literally was a reactionary donor, with some exceptions. She does exactly what, you know, people like Linda and Nancy tell you not to do, which is just do it, like just give it. You know, she just had no plan. Now, what happened, of course, was that she was diagnosed with this brain cancer, which hastened her need to figure out where her money was going to go. And so sadly, she had to do what some people, you know, most people of more average means often find themselves faced with doing, which is quickly scrambling to figure out their estate plan. Now, she apparently constantly changed her will, and it was constantly changing based on, I love this person, I met a development officer I met this person whose cause I supported. You know, sometimes I think about all of the issues that are unfolding in our world today and what Joan would write, you know, $1 billion check for, because she would. Um, so I, it wasn't. It's not fair to say that it was capricious. But if her executor said to me, if she had died a year later or 10 years later, it would have all been completely different. And the fact that she did dissolve her foundation really disappointed that particular executor, because if she'd kept it in a foundation, as you all probably know, it would have grown and grown and grown. It would still be given today. But instead, she just gave it all away. And the big gift that she gave to the Salvation Army was even a mystery to her closest people, um, because it wasn't what they would have necessarily expected that she would do. Even though she built that one center in San Diego as a test, um, again, if she hadn't been diagnosed with that brain cancer, she might have pivoted a different way. And I love the story about how she had this $250 million in this leftover bank account that she was going to give to both NPR and PBS. And PBS never returned the call. So NPR got the whole wad of money.
That's what
That's a
I, that
crazy
was,
story.
that's just history. That's just history for all of us in public. You know, as development people, we were all in awe of that. And it was always answer the phone, no
Answer
matter
the phone.
when, no matter how, answer the phone.
Years ago, when the email first came online, I was working at the New York Times. I was one of the first people to have an email address at the New York Times, lisa@nytimes.com. And I would get mail from people. Sometimes it was really nasty. I mean, today, by today's standards, it's nothing. Nothing like the Twitter universe we live in now. But I would get mail, sometimes nasty, sometimes nice, asking me to talk to groups, and I always answered it because you never know. You never know. And then when I heard that story, I thought, well,
Right, right. Well, Linda Ballinger would like to know Did Joan Kroc ever meet Betty Ford? It seems like their paths would have crossed in California.
They had met, and she was a big supporter of Betty Ford's clinic. Yes, they had met, and I did talk with Betty's daughter Susan. There wasn't much to say. They were, grand dames in, united in their path, and Hazelden was more of a recipient. Now Betty Ford and Hazelden are united together. Oh, I forgot that part. I haven't talked about this in a long time, and I'm so delighted to be talking about it. I did find the films that Joan Kroc made while she was in her anti-alcoholism crusading period in Hazelden, um, quite by accident. And then I found the actual original films. Somebody who worked with Joan had them literally behind his couch, and he and his wife were downsizing and about to move. So I've got them preserved at Hazelden. And, I have so many dreams about Joan, but it's been really hard to get people interested in this story, to do more to honor her. And those films are really interesting films. So yes, they did know. They weren't, intimates, but they definitely traveled in those same circles of people who were early on in the recovery movement, which is another part of the story that's so remarkable today. Anybody goes into rehab, I get rehab ads all the time. I'm not sure why on my computer. It's fascinating that it's not shameful mostly anymore. People go for addiction treatment all the time, but the fact that they were pioneers in that world. I knew that Betty Ford was, but I had no idea that Joan Kroc was writing checks to people like Betty Ford. Um, and I wanted people to know that. I thought that was important. I found people along the way when this book came out who were very angry, actually. How could you talk about Ray Kroc as an alcoholic? I said, I wasn't outing him as an alcoholic because that was known. Um, I thought it was, there were intimations about other things that went on, that I didn't write about because I could never prove it. But I did think it was important to talk about what Joan did in reaction to Ray. So
Do you feel like Joan was influenced by personal connections in her giving, or just people approaching her on the street, or was she a woman of determination and just, or was she more influenced by people around her that?
all of the above. I mean, the story of how she was sitting on a plane next to a woman who, again, we take hospice for granted. Sadly, we've probably all known somebody who's been helped by hospice at the end of. I mean, we've all been helped by hospice at the end of life, but um, she was with a woman on a plane randomly who happened to be a doctor, which dazzled Joan, who wished she'd had an education. And this woman was talking about the hospice movement. And then all of a sudden, Joan's father was helped by hospice early on, as was Ray when he died. And Joan just started writing checks to this woman to help her set up what was the first freestanding hospice in San Diego. So she was remarkable in that way too. Again, capricious. It's like, you're cool. I'm going to write you a million. And that's how that chain reaction sculpture started. She got interested in the peace movement, and she became friendly with, she went to see Paul Conrad speak. And that was around the time that she became friends with Father Ted Hesburgh, who ran Notre Dame. A lot of people think that she was Catholic because she gave a lot of money to Notre Dame and to USD to start these peace institutes. But it was really, she saw Father Hesburgh speak, was dazzled by him, saw Paul Conrad speak, was dazzled by him, became friendly with both of them, and then started writing them checks. And Paul once, on one of her yachts, said, I really want to make this sculpture. And she said, how much is it going to cost? And he said, about $250,000 to forge it. And she said, I'll give you the money, but just don't tell anybody you got it from me. Because at that point, people were approaching. I mean, people were constantly knocking down her door. After the book came out, I was doing a talk like this, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, my father was retired dentist hired by Joan to run a clinic on the the Mexico border in Santa Ynez, where it was all free care, free dental care. It was all underwritten by her, and no one ever knew that she, I mean, he knew, but nobody who went in there knew that it was her who'd set it up. So
Wow.
it's pretty amazing.
She was amazing.
She was amazing.
Well, as I'll ask one more question here, and
Yes.
it's about your NPR founding mothers. You wrote that book as well.
Yes.
Tell us who the most interesting person that you interviewed was when you wrote that book.
Oh, without a doubt, the living person I interviewed who was most interesting is the person I dedicate the book to, who is the man who's seen as the founding father of NPR. His name is Bill Siemering, and he was the first executive at National Public Radio when it was chartered in 1970. He'd come from Buffalo by way of Wisconsin, where he'd worked at educational radio stations. And he was hired to help set the tone and tenor of NPR. And he was the person who was so welcoming to women in those early days. And he was also a visionary. He was a visionary who was not a great administrator, which is why he wasn't there longer. But in talking with him over the course of time, he's now 86, and hearing him reflect back on that time was just a delight. It's slippery slope, as they say, when you go into somebody's history, their memory banks. I know that myself personally, but it's also really delightful when you can talk with someone, especially later in their years, and say, "You did something really cool. Can I ask you about it?" And that was the case with all these people who I unearthed with Joan Kroc, who'd made these movies for her or done all these different, and with NPR as well. They didn't know when they started it that it was going to be this thing, this huge ecosystem. I mean, they wanted it to be, but they had no idea how to get from here to here, and that they ever would. And of course, the whole media landscape was completely different in 1971 than it is today. And so it was just a different universe. So for him to look at him now and to ask him to reflect back and to have dug up papers that he'd written a zillion years ago, as a much younger man with this heady idea, it was really super. It was really, really exciting. So to be able to honor somebody like him, who isn't well known to most of us, was really delightful.
Well, Lisa Napoli, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you for being part of the book club, and thank you for your support of public radio. Lisa, may our paths cross again.
I hope so. And before we go, I want to say I'm sending you the link, if everyone wants to grab it, to the J&R Double R Trench,
Look
which
at
is
that
the
hamburger building, everyone. Yes.
I think it's in there. I think it's in there. If it's not, what I can do, I'm sorry I didn't do this. I didn't think to do this before. Nancy, I can send you a list of a couple of links of things if you want, if people want to follow up, and I will. Yeah, I will follow up with you because I'd love for you to see them. It's really fun, and I'd love and grateful if you share the book with
Thank you.
others and check out my other ones. Yes, thank you.
We'll spread the word. Thank you, Lisa. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you, Louie. I'm going to write to you privately.